They seized one human engineer. Then she took over their warship. I had been lying on my bunk for 2 hours staring at the ceiling of my quarters aboard the relay station Harrow, running system schematics through my head the way some people count sheep. I was not anxious. I was not restless. I was simply a person whose brain does not know how to stop working. And that night it had decided to revisit the thermal coupling problem I had been solving for the past 4 days. So when the proximity alert lit up every panel on the station, and a voice came through the overhead speaker announcing unregistered vessels approaching from the trade corridor, I was already sitting upright with my boots in my hand. My name is Mara Voss. I am 34 years old. I have a degree in mechanical engineering, a second degree in integrated systems architecture, and enough field certifications to fill a wall I do not bother decorating. I have worked on 3 deep space installations and 2 planetary outposts, and I have been the lead systems engineer aboard Harrow for the past 18 months. If something on this station breaks, I fix it. If something on this station needs building, I build it. If something on this station needs understanding, I understand it first and ask questions after. I was in the corridor before the second alert sounded. The Vethkai ships came in fast and came in quiet. 2 of them, compact and angular, built the way their culture builds everything, with a rigid sense of superiority expressed in every line and surface. I had seen their vessels in intelligence briefings. They used an over-centralized power architecture, all systems routed through one command node. Efficient, the briefings said. The station commander, a solid and careful man named Owen Greer, was already on the bridge when I arrived. He had his hands clasped behind his back, and his eyes on the approach vectors on the main screen. He was the kind of person who became more still when things became more dangerous, and right now he was very still. "Voss," he said without turning around, "tell me about their docking capability." "Their forward clamps can interface with our emergency port," I said. "It was not designed for that, but it will hold." "How long to reseal if they breach?" "Depends how they breach." He turned and looked at me. "Best case. 4 minutes." He nodded slowly and turned back to the screen. The Vethkai ships were no longer accelerating. They were holding position. That was the moment I knew this was not an inspection and not a trade dispute. Ships that want to talk do not hold position 50 meters off your hull. Ships that are deciding how to move do. The communication came in on the open frequency, which meant they wanted everyone to hear it, not just command. A senior Vethkai officer identified himself as Fleet Executor Cale Dran and announced that the station Harrow was operating in a corridor that fell under Vethkai provisional authority. and that all crew were to assemble in the main bay for processing. He used the word processing the way someone uses a polite word when they mean something much less polite. Owen did not hesitate. He opened the station-wide channel and told the crew to shelter in place and seal their section doors. He told them to stay calm. He was good at his job. Then he told me, quietly, off the open channel, "Your access credentials cover more of this station than anyone else's. If they board and they know that, they will want me," I said. "Yes." I thought about it for approximately 2 seconds. "Then let them find me." He looked at me the way people look at you when they are not sure if you are brave or simply strange. I have gotten that look my whole life. I did not explain myself. There was not time, and honestly, there is never enough context to make it make sense quickly. The short version is this. I was not being heroic. The Vethkai boarded through the emergency port exactly as I predicted, using a clamping mechanism that left 3 small stress fractures in our outer hull that I mentally noted I would need to seal later. They moved through the station in units of 4, dressed in articulated suits the color of dark iron, visors sealed. They were organized. They were fast. They had clearly done this before. They found me in Corridor 7, standing next to a junction panel with a diagnostic tool in my hand, because I had decided that if I was going to be found, I was going to be found doing my job. The lead officer stopped in front of me. He was tall, even by Vethkai standards, with a build that suggested his species put a serious amount of resources into physical presence. His visor was clear enough that I could see his eyes. They were amber, with pupils that contracted to vertical slits when they focused. He looked at me the way you look at something you are not sure is a threat or a tool. "You are the systems engineer," he said. His translator rendered it in flat, serviceable English. "I am a systems engineer," I said. "There are 3 of us. I am the one who knows where everything is." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come." I put the diagnostic tool in my pocket. He did not tell me to leave it. That was the first mistake he made with me, though it was far from the last. They walked me through the station, past sealed section doors where I could hear my colleagues behind the walls. Quiet, following Owen's instructions, staying safe. I was glad for that. I was glad Owen was the kind of commander he was. I walked with the Vethkai unit without resistance, without drama, and I used every second of that walk to observe. Their suit joints had a slight lag on the left side. A calibration issue, probably a standard maintenance skip. The unit leader checked his wrist panel every 40 seconds, which meant he was tracking something on a timer. 2 of the 4 officers wore their sidearms on the right hip with the retention clip fastened, which told me they were following regulation rather than instinct. Regulation people follow procedures. Procedure people are predictable. The boarding shuttle was docked at the emergency port, and they put me inside it before I had a full picture of its interior. The seats were designed for Vethkai proportions, too wide and too reclined for me, and the restraints that they used to secure my wrists to a structural bar were sized for Vethkai wrists, which meant they were not quite tight enough for mine. I did not test this immediately. I simply noted it. The shuttle detached from Harrow with a sound like a heavy door closing, and I felt the vibration of the engines through the seat and through the bar my wrists were secured to. Through the single narrow viewport on the far side of the cabin, I could see Harrow getting smaller, its running lights steady and patient in the dark. I watched it until I could not see it anymore. Then I looked around my new environment. The shuttle interior was compact and functional, built with that same over-centralized logic I had noted in the briefings. Control panels were visible and unshielded, laid out along the port wall in a sequence I could already partially parse. Not the language. I did not speak Vethkai. But engineering logic is engineering logic. Inputs on the left, outputs on the right, status indicators in the middle. The color coding used amber for active systems and a deep blue for standby, which was the reverse of what I was used to. But the reverse of something familiar is still familiar. The warship came into view through the viewport, the Ascendant Claw. It was large, not the largest vessel I had seen in schematics, but large in the way that things are large when you are about to be put inside them against your will. It had a forward rake to its design, like something perpetually leaning into an argument. Its hull was the same dark iron color as the officers' suits, broken by long parallel ridges that I suspected served a dual purpose, as both structural reinforcement and heat distribution channels. Beautiful engineering, I thought. Genuinely. We docked with a precision that I had to respect. The pilot was skilled. The docking clamps engaged with barely a shudder. The unit leader unclipped my restraints from the bar and told me to stand. I stood. He told me to walk. I walked. They brought me through 2 pressurized corridors, past crew members who stopped to look at me with the particular curiosity of people who have not seen many humans in person. I looked back at all of them with the same calm interest. I was cataloging everything: ceiling height, conduit placement, the location of every panel cover I passed, the sound of the ventilation system, the slight variation in floor temperature that told me we were passing over the primary power routing beneath the deck plating. The room they put me in was not a cell. That was their second mistake, and it was a much bigger one than the first. It was a maintenance access shaft, a long, low crawl space built into the engineering section of the ship, used by their technical crew to reach the systems that ran behind the walls. It had a locking panel on the outside, which is why they chose it. But it also had a full set of junction access points running its entire length, bundled conduits for power, data, environmental control, and propulsion monitoring, 3 separate thermal regulation nodes, and enough panel covers that I lost count after 16. The unit leader looked at me standing in the entrance to the shaft, and I could see him deciding that it was secure enough. It had a lock. It had no viewport. It had no obvious way out. He did not think about what was inside it. "You will be questioned," he said, "when the fleet executor is ready for you." "Of course," I said. He sealed the panel behind me. I stood in the low light of the maintenance shaft and listened to his footsteps move away down the corridor. I listened until I could not hear them. Then I sat down cross-legged on the deck plating, pulled the diagnostic tool from my pocket, and got to work. I did not panic. Panic is a response to helplessness, and I was not helpless. I was in an unfamiliar place with unfamiliar systems, and my wrists had faint marks from the restraints, and I was a prisoner aboard an alien warship, yes. But I also had a diagnostic tool, 2 hours of observed data about the ship's exterior and corridors, a mental map of every conduit bundle I had seen since boarding, and 18 months of practice solving problems in exactly this kind of contained, pressurized, resource-limited environment. The first thing I did was not touch anything. I sat in the dim shaft, and I breathed slowly, and I looked. The shaft was approximately 12 meters long, and low enough that I had to sit rather than stand. On both sides, running the full length, were bundled conduits, organized into color-coded groups by the same amber and blue logic I had observed on the shuttle. The floor was bare metal, with a textured grip surface. The ceiling had 3 light panels, 2 of which were active, 1 of which was dark and probably blown. There were 9 panel covers on the left wall and 7 on the right. 4 junction boxes were mounted at intervals, each one with an external status indicator showing steady amber, active, stable, nominal. I began with observation before I moved to any kind of physical interaction. I watched the indicators. I listened to the hum of the conduits, which changes in pitch and intensity depending on load. I placed my palm flat on the deck and felt the vibration pattern of the engines below me. a slow, steady rhythm that told me we were holding position rather than moving. Good. Moving ships have more active monitoring. After 20 minutes of listening, I reached out and touched the nearest conduit bundle. Not to manipulate it, just to feel its temperature. Heat in a conduit tells you how much current it is carrying. This one was warm but not hot. A secondary load, not a primary line. The bundle above it was cooler. The one below was noticeably warmer. Primary power routing, running just beneath the main bundle. That is where the significant systems connect. I moved along the shaft slowly, touching and listening and watching, building a picture of what lived behind these walls the way you build any picture. One careful detail at a time. The first junction box I opened, with the flathead end of my diagnostic tool, which fit the panel screws in a way that told me Vethkai and human engineering had independently arrived at similar fastener geometries, which I found genuinely interesting. Revealed a routing board with 12 active connections and 4 inactive ones. The active connections were labeled in Vethkai script. I could not read the labels. I did not need to. I traced each connection from its entry point to its exit point and matched them to the conduit temperatures I had already logged. By elimination and logic, I identified the environmental control line, the data relay line, and what I was almost certain was the internal communications trunk. I did not touch those connections. Not yet. I closed the panel, refastened the screws to exactly the tension I had found them at, and moved to the second box. I worked like this for 3 hours. By the end of those 3 hours, I had a working map of the shaft's systems that covered power distribution to 4 sections of the ship, environmental controls for 6 zones, the internal communications network, a data relay that I believed connected to navigation, and 2 lines I had not yet identified that ran toward the forward section of the ship, in a configuration that suggested weapons systems. I was sitting with my back against the wall, eyes closed, running the map through my head again from the beginning, when the lock on the shaft entrance clicked. I put my diagnostic tool in my pocket and folded my hands in my lap and waited. The panel opened. A Vethkai technician looked in, younger than the officers, wearing a lighter version of the suit, with a small toolkit at his belt, and the slightly distracted expression of someone who has been sent to do a routine check and would rather be doing something else. He looked at me. I looked at him. "Comfortable?" he said. His translator was a small device clipped to his collar, cruder than the unit leader's built-in model, and it rendered his words with a slight delay. "Adequately," I said. He checked a panel on the wall beside the entrance, looked at a readout, and nodded to himself. Then he looked at me again with that same curiosity I had seen in the corridor, the look of a person who finds something slightly unexpected and cannot quite categorize it. "You are an engineer," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. He looked at the shaft around me, at the panels, the conduits, the junction boxes. Then he looked back at me. Something shifted in his expression, very slightly, like a person who has just noticed something they probably should have noticed sooner. But he did not act on it. He closed the panel and left. I listened to his footsteps. They were quick, slightly uneven. Someone who walks fast when they are uneasy. I noted that and filed it away. Then I opened the third junction box. What I found there made me sit back for a moment and simply appreciate it. The Vethkai had designed their internal network with a beauty that I genuinely respected, a layered redundancy system that looked complex from the outside, but was, once you traced it, perfectly logical from the inside. Every major system had a primary line and a secondary line running parallel, but both secondary lines routed through one shared switching node. It was elegant. It reduced hardware requirements significantly, and it meant that if you controlled the switching node, you controlled all the secondary lines simultaneously. I did not have access to the switching node from this shaft, But I had access to the data relay line, and the data relay line, from what I had traced, was connected to the same network tier as the internal communications trunk. I took my diagnostic tool and I held it for a long moment without moving. What I was about to do was not breaking anything. I was not going to damage their systems. I was not going to disrupt anything in a way that would be visible or alarming. I was going to listen. I was going to find the communications channel and open a passive tap. Receive only. No transmission. No signal that I was there. And I was going to listen to every internal conversation on this ship until I knew it as well as I knew Harrow. I found the right connection point on the data relay. I used the diagnostic tool to bridge it with a loop that fed signal to a secondary output without interrupting the primary flow. It took 11 minutes and I had to redo the third connection twice because my hands were working in low light, and the connectors were sized for Vethkai hands, not mine. But I got it. The sound that came through was not words at first. It was the noise of a ship, the background conversation of systems talking to each other in tones and pulses. I had been listening to that kind of noise since I was 22 years old on my first installation job, and I found it as familiar and readable as language. Then the voices started. I did not understand the words, but I could hear rhythm, tone, urgency, routine. I could hear when someone was giving orders, and when someone was reporting. I could hear the particular flatness of someone reading from a display, and the different quality of someone speaking from memory. I listened for 2 hours, and in those 2 hours I began to build a picture of the command structure of this ship from nothing but the sound of how people spoke to each other. The fleet executor's voice was distinct, slower than the others, with a deliberate weight to each word that spoke of someone who is accustomed to not repeating himself. He spoke infrequently, which meant he spoke purposefully. The next voice I identified was quick and clipped. A logistics officer, I thought, from the pattern of information in the exchanges. Then a slower, more careful voice that I associated with navigation from the sequence of conversations around travel decisions. By the time they came to question me, I knew the rough shape of their crew's upper structure. 2 officers arrived this time, not the original unit. One of them carried a flat recording device and the other carried a small case that I did not need to look inside to guess the purpose of. I was not afraid of the case. I had been afraid of things before. Real fear. The kind that tightens your chest and makes your hands shake. And I knew what that felt like. This was not it. This was a situation that required concentration, not fear. The officer with the recording device asked me, through his translator, what I knew about the station, Harrow's defensive network, and the cargo manifest stored in its sealed systems. I told him I was a mechanical engineer. I told him I worked on physical systems, plumbing, structural integrity, thermal regulation. I told him the sealed manifest was beyond my access level, and I had never seen its contents. None of that was entirely true. But none of it was entirely false either. And a good partial truth delivered with complete calm is almost indistinguishable from the real thing. He asked me why I had been found in the corridor with a diagnostic tool when the alert sounded, rather than in my quarters. I told him I had been running a late maintenance check on Junction Panel 7 when the alert came through, and I had not had time to return to quarters before the lockdown. He wrote something on the recording device. Then he looked at me for a long moment. "You are calm," he said. It sounded like an observation and an accusation at the same time. "I am an engineer," I said. "We are always calm. Problems do not get smaller when you stop being calm." He looked at his colleague. His colleague looked at him. There was a short exchange in Vethkai that the translator did not render, which told me either the translator was selective or they had switched it off intentionally. I noted the timing of the exchange and the fact that the colleague responded with what sounded like a question. Then the first officer looked back at me. "You will stay here," he said. "We will return." "Of course," I said. he asked, almost as an afterthought, if I had anything to write with. I said I did not. He produced a stylus from his case, the kind used to input data into HFY panels, and placed it on the floor of the shaft in front of me. If you remember access codes, he said, write them down. It will be better for you. I picked up the stylus and held it as though I were thinking about the codes I allegedly did not have. He sealed the panel. I turned the stylus over in my hands. It was a standard HFY input stylus, pressure-sensitive tip, conductive barrel, exactly the right diameter to fit into a bypass port on a junction panel, if you remove the tip housing and use the barrel as a conductor. I removed the tip housing in about 40 seconds. Then I looked at the third junction box, the one with the shared switching node access, and I thought about everything I had mapped in the past 6 hours. I thought about the environmental control lines, the communications trunk, the weapons relay, the navigation data feed, the internal door locks, and the gravity plating controls. I thought about all the ways a ship is just a very large machine, and all the ways a machine, no matter how sophisticated, can be understood by anyone patient enough to listen to it. I did not rush. Rushing is how you make mistakes, and I did not have the resources to correct mistakes. I reached into the fourth junction box, the one I had not yet opened, and I began to learn what was inside it. It took me another 4 hours to finish the map. By the time I was done, I knew this ship the way I know Harrow. Not perfectly, not completely, but well enough. Well enough is all you need. Perfect knowledge is a luxury. Working knowledge is a tool. I sat back against the wall and closed my eyes and went through the full sequence in my head. Every step, every timing consideration, every point where something might go wrong and what I would do if it did. I ran it 3 times from beginning to end, adjusting the second and third passes based on what I had spotted in the first. Then I rested, because resting before you act is not weakness, it is engineering. The last thing I thought before I let myself sleep for a few hours was this. They put me in their engine room. They looked at a maintenance shaft full of junction boxes and conduit bundles and access panels, and they saw a cell. I saw a workshop. I woke to the sound of a shift change. I could tell it was a shift change from the pattern of footsteps outside the shaft, more of them than usual, moving in 2 directions at once. The organized shuffle of people handing off responsibility to other people. I had been listening to the rhythms of this ship long enough that the deviation from normal was immediately clear. I lay still and counted the footsteps and estimated the number of crew members involved. 12 to 15, moving toward the forward sections. That was the incoming shift. The outgoing shift would be moving to quarters, which were aft on most vessels of this configuration. I had approximately 40 minutes before the new shift was fully settled and alert. I sat up, rolled my shoulders, checked the diagnostic tool and the modified stylus in my pocket, and began. The first thing I did was targeted, small, and invisible. In the environmental control line, behind the 4th junction panel, there was a secondary thermal regulator for the command deck. It was connected to a simple adjustment node that I had spent 2 hours the previous night learning the input logic of, not the language, but the mathematical rhythm of how the system received change commands. Increase was a sustained pulse of a specific length. Decrease was a shorter pulse with a pause before it. I used the modified stylus as a conductor to deliver a decrease command to that node. Not a dramatic one, not a sudden one. I dropped the command deck's temperature by 2 degrees. Then I waited 5 minutes, then 2 more after that. I did not need a fast result. I needed a quiet one. The HFY are physiologically cold-sensitive in a way that humans are not. I had read the biological summary in the same set of briefings where I had studied their ship design. Their metabolic efficiency drops measurably when ambient temperature falls below a certain threshold. Not incapacitating, not dangerous, but enough to slow reflexes, slow thinking, and, crucially, increase the desire to focus on comfort over tasks. 6 degrees of cooling on the command deck would not put anyone out of commission. It would make them slightly less sharp. In a controlled, static situation that might not matter. In a situation where they also had a navigation display that kept producing confusing readouts, it would matter quite a lot. The navigation display issue was next. The data relay line I had tapped for communications was connected, at one junction, to what I was now reasonably confident was the navigation sensor network. I could not read the data moving through that line. It was beyond my ability to decode without far more time than I had. But I did not need to read it. I needed to introduce a small inconsistency into it that would manifest as a display error on the bridge. This was the most technically delicate thing I had done so far, and I spent 40 minutes working through it before I touched anything. I was looking for a place where I could insert a brief interruption, a gap small enough not to trigger an automated alert, large enough to cause the display to show a data mismatch. Navigation systems are built to flag inconsistencies for human review, because the consequence of navigating on bad data is severe. A mismatch flagged for human review means an officer has to stop what they are doing and investigate. 2 or 3 of those, spaced out, means an officer who is increasingly focused on the navigation display and decreasingly focused on everything else. I found the right junction point. I delivered the interruption. Once. Then I waited 20 minutes and delivered it again. Then I listened through my communications tap. It took 11 minutes. Then I heard the quick clipped voice I had identified as the logistics officer, reporting something to the fleet executor's voice, and a third voice, the careful one I had associated with navigation, responding with what sounded, from its rhythm and hesitation, like someone explaining that they were not sure why the discrepancy had appeared. The fleet executor's response was short. I had heard that length and tone from supervisors my entire career. It meant, figure it out, and do not bother me again until you have. The navigation officer's next exchange was with someone else, longer, more technical in cadence. They were pulling someone in to double-check the display. 2 people now focused on a problem I had manufactured out of nothing. I pulled the tap off the navigation feed. I did not want to risk it becoming visible, and reconnected the tap purely to the communications trunk. Then I worked on the door locks. This was the step I had spent the most preparation time on, because it was the step with the most variables. The internal door locks on the Ascendant Claw used a network connection that I had traced to the shared switching node I had identified in the 3rd junction box. I could not access the switching node directly from the shaft, but I had found something better during my overnight mapping. A maintenance override port on the 4th junction box that connected to the door network for the purpose of allowing engineering crew to lock or unlock individual sections during repair work. The override port was not labeled as such in any language I could read. I had identified it by the logic of its position, its connection type, and the fact that it was the only port in the box that had a physical key slot beside it, rather than just a data connection, which meant it was designed to work without network access, which meant it was a manual fallback, which meant it talked directly to the lock hardware. I spent 1 full hour understanding how to communicate with that port, using the modified stylus and the diagnostic tool as a signal generator. 1 hour of testing with the smallest possible inputs, watching indicator lights respond, building the control vocabulary 1 entry at a time. By the end of that hour, I could lock and unlock individual sections of the ship. I did not use that capability yet. I set it up, and I left it ready, and I moved to the next problem. The next problem was external communications. Cutting external communications from a maintenance shaft would normally be impossible. The antenna systems and long-range communication hardware lived in completely different sections of the ship, connected through their own dedicated lines that did not run through the engineering access shaft at all. But I had found something during my mapping that I had been thinking about ever since. In the communications trunk that I had tapped on the second day, there was a signal amplification node, a device that boosted the internal communications signal to ensure it reached all sections of the ship clearly. That amplification node was connected to the main communications network not just for internal signals, but as a relay point for the external array as well, because the Vethkai had designed their communications with the same over-centralized logic they had applied to everything else. Everything goes through one node. Change the node, change everything. I could not cut the external communications cleanly. I could not access the array itself, but I could introduce enough signal noise into the amplification node to make the outgoing signal unusable. Not obviously cut, not obviously jammed, but degraded past the point of coherence. To anyone monitoring from outside the ship, it would look like a technical fault. To anyone inside the ship, the outgoing communications would seem to be attempting to transmit normally. It would take them time to find the fault, time I intended to use. I built the noise injection slowly, incrementally, over the course of 2 hours. By the time I was done, the external communications array of the Ascendant Claw was producing a signal that would have been useless to anyone trying to receive it. Then I heard it. Through the communications tap, through the internal network I had been listening to for nearly 2 days, I heard the fleet executor's voice delivering a message that his translator would have rendered into English as follows, if I had been on the bridge and wearing a translator. Harrow Station. You have 2 hours to surrender the cargo manifest and all crew to Vethkai custody. If you do not comply, your engineer will be the demonstration of our resolve. I sat with that for a moment. Owen would not surrender. I knew Owen. He was the kind of person who would rather negotiate for a decade than make the wrong call in 2 hours. And the crew, my crew, would not pressure him to trade away what mattered for what amounted to a threat. They knew I would not want them to. I hoped they knew that. But the fleet executor did not know any of that. He was applying standard pressure. He expected standard results. What he was about to get was not standard. I picked up my modified stylus and my diagnostic tool, and I looked at the full length of the maintenance shaft around me. 12 meters of every important system on this ship, laid out in parallel lines along both walls, waiting to respond to the right inputs. I went to the gravity plating control line first. I had saved that one. It was the most significant physical effect I could produce from this shaft. Not because gravity loss was dangerous to them in the way it might have been to an unprepared human, but because it was disorienting, destabilizing, and above all impossible to command through if you are suddenly floating in an environment designed for standing and walking and sitting in chairs bolted to a floor. The weapons deck. That was where I aimed it. Not the whole ship, just the weapons deck, plating control at the precise moment that I also locked every internal bulkhead door on the forward third of the ship. Through the walls, through the hull, I heard the difference. Not chaos, just a sudden, sharp reorganization of sound. The kind of sound a ship makes when something has changed very fast, and the people inside it are responding to that change. Then I picked up the diagnostic tool and walked to the end of the maintenance shaft where the external panel was, and I used the bypass that I had set up 48 hours ago on the lock mechanism, and I opened the door from the inside. The corridor was empty. The crew members who would have been here were either in the forward section dealing with the gravity situation, or in the aft section dealing with the navigation display, or on the command deck, which was 6 degrees cooler than it should have been, and had been that way long enough to matter. I walked through the ship. I want to be precise about this, because I think the word walked is doing important work in that sentence. I did not run. I did not move low, or fast, or with the particular tension of someone trying not to be seen. I walked with purpose, because a person walking with purpose in a corridor reads as belonging there. A person moving carefully reads as hiding. I had observed enough of the crew's movement patterns through 2 days of listening to know which corridors would be clear and for how long. I moved through 2 sections, turned twice, and arrived at the bridge entrance. It was a double-panel door, sealed from the inside. I had the maintenance override that could unlock it if the lock was connected to the same network node as the others, which, given the ship's design philosophy, it almost certainly was. It was. The door opened. The bridge of the Ascendant Claw was larger than I expected, with a tiered layout that put the command station at the center rear on a raised platform, and the operational stations arranged in a forward arc. Several officers were at their stations. The navigation officer was at his console, looking at a display that was showing him data I had made unreliable. The communications officer had a set of diagnostic instruments laid out in front of him that told me he was already trying to find the fault in the external transmission array. And at the command station, on the raised platform, standing rather than sitting, because he was clearly a person who stood when he was thinking, the fleet executor, Cale Dran. Tall, amber-eyed, with an expression of controlled authority that I recognized as the face of someone who is not yet aware that a situation has already resolved itself without their input. He turned when the door opened. Every person on the bridge turned. I walked in. The silence lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then the fleet executor said something in Vethkai that his translator, apparently still active, rendered as, "What is this?" Not a question. A statement of controlled incomprehension. "My name is Mara Voss," I said. I spoke clearly, and at a normal volume. "I have been in your maintenance shaft for the past 2.5 days. I now have operational control of your environmental systems, your internal door network, your weapons deck gravity." I paused. "I would like to discuss the terms of my crew's safe return." The fleet executor looked at me for a long time. The expression on his face moved through several stages that I watched with interest. Incomprehension. Assessment. A rapid internal review of the past 2 days that I could see happening in his eyes, as he started to connect events he had probably attributed to technical faults. Then something that was not quite respect but was adjacent to it. For 2.5 days. You gave me a stylus, I said, and you put me in your engine room. He was quiet. Around him, his crew was very still, waiting. I could hear the ventilation and the soft sounds of the systems I had altered, continuing to do what I had asked them to do. I crossed the bridge, sat down in an empty seat at one of the secondary stations, not the command chair. I was not here to posture, and I pulled up the nearest display. It was locked to my biometrics, but the secondary diagnostic port on the panel edge was not, and I had the stylus. I am going to restore your navigation display now, I said. I will restore your external communications when we have an agreement about my crew. Your gravity plating on the weapons deck will stay off until then, because I would rather have a conversation than a confrontation, and that arrangement supports conversation. The fleet executor came down from the raised platform slowly. He was thinking, I could tell, at a high level, not about tactics, not about how to recover the immediate situation, but about something larger. He stopped a few meters from my station. What do you want? He said. Safe passage for the Harrow crew, I said. Full withdrawal from the corridor, and a direct channel to tell my commander that I am not harmed. He looked at me for another long moment. And if I refuse? Then the navigation display stays unreliable. Your external communications stay degraded. Your weapons crew stays in zero gravity. And I start working on the propulsion monitoring node, which I have not touched yet, but which is right behind panel 7, in the shaft I just left. I kept my voice level. I am not trying to harm anyone on this ship. I am trying to go home. The fleet executor was quiet, for what felt like a very long time, but was probably about 30 seconds. Then he said something in Vethkai to his communications officer. The officer responded. The fleet executor looked back at me. Your channel, he said. Then we will talk. The communications officer opened an internal line and patched it to the external array, working around the noise injection I had introduced by using a backup frequency I had not touched. Smart, I noted. He was good at his job. The line connected to Harrow. Owen's voice came through immediately, which told me he had been monitoring for a signal. Voss, he said, just my name. But the way he said it carried about 6 different things. Still here, I said. Working on it. Stand by. Owen, to his credit, simply said, standing by. I looked at the fleet executor. He was watching me with the expression of someone who is revising a very large number of assumptions very quickly. Now, I said, let us talk. The negotiation took 4 hours. I want to be accurate about that because I have heard the story retold in ways that make it sound faster, more dramatic, more like something from a broadcast adventure. It was not. It was 4 hours of careful, patient, specific conversation between me and the fleet executor of the Vethkai warship Ascendant Claw, conducted in a mixture of translated Vethkai and simple English, on a bridge where every officer had stopped doing anything else and was watching with the focused attention of people who are witnessing something they will be describing for years. Kale Dran was not a poor negotiator. I want to say that clearly, because what happened should not be misunderstood as the victory of someone clever over someone foolish. He was intelligent, deliberate, and precise. He did not waste words. He understood leverage, and he understood what he had and what he did not have. And he adjusted his position as new information made the old position untenable. That is not a skill everyone has. Many people, when faced with the rearrangement of their expectations, retreat to stubbornness. He did not. What he did not have was context. He did not know how humans think about enclosed spaces. He did not know how humans think about machines. He did not know that for a certain kind of person, the kind who finds their way into deep space engineering, through a combination of aptitude and the inability to stop asking how things work, an unfamiliar room full of systems is not a prison. It is an invitation. He had treated me as a variable he had already solved for. That is the mistake. You should never treat an engineer as a solved variable. Engineers do not stay solved. By the end of the first hour, we had agreed on the basic framework. The Harrow crew would not be disturbed. The cargo manifest would not be accessed by Vethkai personnel. Harrow would remain in its position in the corridor, unboarded. The second hour covered the details, which is where most negotiations actually live. The details were contentious in specific places, and I let them be contention when I had room to give, and held firm when I did not. By the third hour, something had shifted in the dynamic on the bridge. The officers who had been frozen at their stations had quietly resumed working. I had restored navigation in the first 40 minutes as a demonstration of good faith, and the temperature on the command deck was returning to normal, as I had incrementally reversed the cooling I had introduced. The atmosphere had moved from confrontation to something closer to a very tense professional meeting. At one point, the communications officer, the one who had found the backup frequency to connect me to Harrow, asked me a technical question about the noise injection I had introduced to the amplification node. He wanted to know the method. He was a professional, asking a professional question. I told him. I explained the principle, the connection point, and the input logic I had used to deliver the noise. He nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they are thinking about how to prevent a thing from happening again. I respected that. You should always want to learn from what has been done to your systems. The Vethkai ships would withdraw from the corridor within 2 hours of my return to Harrow. They would not communicate the cargo manifest's contents or location to any other Vethkai authority, because in the agreement as I had structured it, that information was categorized as never having been obtained. The Harrow crew's confinement to their sections during the boarding would be formally recorded as voluntary compliance, rather than forced detention, which mattered for the treaty language that would follow. I had been running the communications tap for the duration of the negotiation, which meant I heard everything said between the fleet executor and his crew during the brief intervals when he consulted with them privately. I am not going to record those conversations. What happens between a commander and his crew in a difficult moment is their business, and I had no more use for that information once the agreement was in place. When we were done, the fleet executor stood, and I stood, and we looked at each other across the bridge of his ship for a moment. You could have damaged systems, he said. You chose not to. I was not here to damage anything, I said. I was here to go home. The navigation fault will take 3 days to fully clear, he said. This was not a complaint. It was an observation, stated with what I think was a kind of professional acknowledgement. The interrupt will self-clear, I said, but the calibration on your sensor alignment has a baseline drift that is not related to anything I did. It has been developing for a while, and the intermittent fault probably masked it. You will want to look at junction 17 in your forward sensor array before you make any high-precision navigation runs. He was quiet for a moment. Why are you telling me that? I thought about it briefly. Because it is a fixable problem, and it is better for everyone if your ship navigates accurately. He looked at me for a moment longer. Then he said something in Vethkai that his translator did not render. I do not know what it was. I decided to accept it as whatever seemed most useful. They returned me to Harrow on the same shuttle I had arrived on, 2 officers accompanying me to the docking port. The restraints they had originally used were not applied this time. I sat in the shuttle seat and looked through the narrow viewport as Harrow grew from a point of light to a shape I recognized. Its running lights were steady. The 3 small stress fractures in the outer hull from the Vethkai clamping mechanism were still there. I was going to need to seal those. The docking clamps engaged, and I was through the port and into the corridor of Harrow before I had fully registered that I was back. Owen was there. Several members of the crew were there. There was a moment that I will not try to describe in detail because it was a personal moment, and the people involved deserve to have it stay personal. I will only say that Owen Greer looked at me with the expression of someone who had been very controlled for a very long time, and was now carefully not being controlled, and I was glad to see his face. "What did you do?" he said. "What was available?" I said. He looked at me for a long moment. "Are you all right?" "I am fine. I am also hungry, and I need to seal 3 stress fractures in the outer hull before I do anything else. And I have about 40 pages of notes in my head about Vethkai engineering design that I want to write down while it is still fresh." I paused. "In that order." He exhaled slowly. Then he laughed, which was the most tired and relieved sound I had heard in several days. Earth's diplomat. They were 4 diplomats and 2 liaison officers, and a legal specialist named Daniel Harthay, who wore a very crisp suit, and asked me very precise questions for 3 hours on the first day, and I answered them as accurately as I could, and by the end of the 3rd hour, he had stopped taking notes and was simply listening, which I took as a compliment. The Vethkai sent a delegation of 3, led not by Fleet Executor Dran but by a senior diplomatic officer whose title translated roughly as Corridor Administrator. She was formal and precise, and managed the considerable challenge of representing a side that had boarded a neutral station and seized a civilian without letting any of that show as disadvantage in her posture. I respected the performance, if not the position. I sat through 12 sessions as a witness and technical advisor. I answered questions about what I had observed aboard the Ascendant Claw, what I had accessed and how, and what effects my actions had on the ship's systems. I was scrupulously accurate. I had no reason not to be. The record needed to be clear. On the 4th day of proceedings, the Vethkai diplomatic officer asked me directly whether I had acted with the authorization of Earth's military or intelligence services. I told her I had acted with the authorization of my own professional judgment, and that no military or intelligence service had any foreknowledge of what I intended to do, because I had not known what I intended to do until I was inside the maintenance shaft and had had time to understand the systems I was working with. She looked at me for a moment. "You acted alone," she said, "without instruction." "I am an engineer," I said. "We solve the problem in front of us with what we have." Daniel Hart, who was sitting to my left, wrote something on his notepad and underlined it. The treaty that emerged from those 12 days was not a simple document. Treaties never are. But the core of it established the corridor as genuinely neutral, Not provisionally, not under Vethkai administrative authority, not subject to reassessment under any clause I could find, and included specific language about the rights of civilian technical personnel aboard neutral stations that Daniel Hart told me, on the last evening, had been quoted from my own answers during witness testimony. "You made good law," he said. "I was just being accurate," I said. "That is how good law gets made," he said. Owen threw a small gathering in the station common room the evening after the Constants departed. It was informal, which is the only kind of gathering he ever threw, because Owen Greer is a person who thinks ceremonies should be proportional to the thing they are marking, and he had a very clear sense that what had happened was significant, but that significance did not require a production. There was food that was better than station standard, which meant someone had raided the good supplies, and there were people I had worked alongside for 18 months and who I was genuinely glad to be sitting with in a warm room, and at one point a crew member named Lynn Farrow, who ran the station's communications systems, and who had been locked in her section for the duration of the boarding with nothing to do but wait and worry, came and sat down beside me and said, very quietly, "When we heard your voice on the channel from their ship, telling Owen to stand by, I have never been so relieved by a voice in my life." I did not know what to say to that immediately, so I said, "I am glad the channel held. Their backup frequency was cleaner than I expected." She looked at me. Then she laughed. "You are impossible," she said, affectionately. "I have been told," I said. Later, in my workshop, which is where I always end up when the day is done, regardless of what the day has contained, I sat at my bench with the piece of Vethkai conduit I had been authorized to keep as a material evidence sample, and I looked at it for a long time. The thermal handling was more sophisticated than the equivalent human component. The material had a composite structure I had not seen before, with a flexibility under pressure that seemed counterintuitive given its density but which, when I thought about the physics of it, made complete sense for a ship designed to operate in high-gravity transit corridors. I made notes, pages of them. I sketched the cross-section structure the way I could estimate it from the outer surface and the thermal behavior I had observed during my time in the shaft. I noted the questions I could not answer from observation alone, the questions that would require testing, or a conversation with someone who had worked with the material before, or both. There were a great many questions. There always are, when you start looking at something properly. I worked until very late. The station was quiet. Outside the viewport at the end of my workshop, the corridor was still and dark, and scattered with the distant points of stars that I had looked at through various viewports my entire adult life, without ever quite becoming indifferent to them. I thought about the maintenance shaft. I thought about 48 hours of listening and mapping and patient, methodical work in a space that most people would have found terrifying. I thought about the fleet executor's face when I walked onto his bridge. I thought about the question he had asked me, "Are all humans like you?" And the answer I had given him. Some of them are better engineers. That is true. I have worked with people whose intuition for systems makes mine look slow, whose ability to read a problem and arrive at its center without the careful circumnavigation I need is something I admire openly. Engineering is a wide discipline, and I am not its finest practitioner. only one of many. What I am, specifically, is a person who does not stop, who, given a wall of unfamiliar systems and no instruction, does not sit down in despair, or wait for rescue, or decide that the situation is beyond what can be understood, who treats every room as a room that can be understood, given enough time and attention, and the willingness to listen before acting. That is not special. That is training, and temperament, and a lot of years of doing a job that requires both. But it is real, and it was enough. I turned the Vethkai conduit over in my hands, and looked at the end cross-section, and thought about what was inside it that I had not been able to see yet. There were things in this piece of material that I had not figured out. There were properties I had observed that I did not yet fully understand. I opened a fresh page in my notebook. Then I got to work. The corridor outside my viewport was quiet. Harrow's systems hummed around me at their normal pitch, steady and familiar, every tone in its right place. Somewhere forward, the stress fractures I had sealed 3 days ago were holding cleanly. Somewhere aft, Lynn Farrow's communications panel was dark for the night, its systems on standby, ready for the morning. Everything was working, everything was understood. Until the next problem came, and there would always be a next problem. This was enough. I wrote the first line of notes and did not look up for 2 hours, and that is where this story ends. Not with ceremony or declaration, but with a workbench and a question, and a person who intends to find the answer. That is, honestly, how most of the best stories end.